good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's History of Anti-Semitism program about the expulsion of the Jews from England. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more and buy tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, so not the chat, the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So today we are so honored to be joined by John Tolan. John is a historian interested in the entangled lives of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Middle Ages and beyond. He has taught in universities in North America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. He is currently Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Nantes in France and member of the Academia Europaea. He's received numerous prizes and distinctions, including 2 major grants from the European Research Council and a prize from the Académie Française. He writes in English, French, and Spanish. His work has been translated into Italian, Turkish, Polish, Russian, Bosnian, Arabic, and Korean. He is author of numerous articles and books, including Saracens, Francis and the Sultan, Faces of Muhammad, I'm sorry if I butcher this, Nouvelle Histoire de l'Islam, 8 to 22 siècles, and England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century. He's one of the 4 coordinators of the European Research Council program, the European Quran. So we have a very distinguished speaker with us today. And you can buy England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to John.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for the introduction, and thank you for making this happen. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you virtually at the invitation of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And Sydney, you can move to the next slide. So is medieval England the crucible of European anti-Semitism? The first accusation that Jews regularly murder Christian children was from 12th century England. Jews were brutally massacred on numerous occasions, in particular 1190 in London, York, and elsewhere, and in 1264 to 1265 during baronial revolts against King Henry III. Henry's son, Edward I, finally expelled the Jews from the kingdom in 1290. English Jewish poet Meir ben Elijah of Norwich, towards the end of the 13th century, wrote a Hebrew poem, "Put a Curse on My Enemy," lambasting the forces of Edom that persecuted Jews in England and praying to God for protection and vengeance. Yet there's a danger for the historian who studies these issues, who plots a timeline from the first allegation of ritual murder, William of Norwich in 1141, to massacres of English Jews by Crusaders in 1190, to the supposed Jewish murder of the boy Hugh of St. Lincoln in 1255, and finally to Edward's expulsion in 1290, a danger, as I said, of reducing the history of English Jews and European Jews more widely into one of persecution and suffering. In the mid-20th century, American historian Salo Barron argued against what he called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Without, of course, denying the persecution and violence, he emphasized how Jews were integrated into the societies and economies of medieval Christendom, how they contributed to them and were influenced socially, culturally, and intellectually by them. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, a number of historians have continued in Barron's wake to explore the history of European Jews, not merely as a marginalized minority and object of persecution, but as a vital part of European society. Israeli historian Elishiva Baumgarten in her study of Jewish family life in medieval France and Germany, finds in rabbinical sources testimony to close and often friendly relation between Jewish and Christian neighbors. Jews hired Christian women to care for their children, sometimes lodging them in their homes, sometimes sending the children to the Christians' homes. This provided daily occasions for Christian and Jewish mothers and children to see each other's homes and lives. In England, as elsewhere in Europe, Jews and Christians interacted daily, buying and selling, borrowing and lending, watching their children play together, sharing meals or stories, working together, coming together at weddings or other celebrations, or making love. Historians have paid less attention to such day-by-day neighborly fraternization than to conflict and violence, because the evidence for these interactions, as for much of daily life for the great majority of Europeans in the Middle Ages, is scarce, and in this case, largely negative. We know about such contact because religious leaders frowned on it and tried to prohibit it. We have to read between the lines of rabbinic responsa or synodal canons to see that these activities that were repeatedly and futilely prohibited must have been part of the daily life of English Jews and Christians. A 12th century French rabbi, for example, said that he had heard from a traveler that English Jews drank beer with Christians, which is prohibited because it might lead to sexual union and apostasy. But perhaps, the rabbi says, they should be forgiven, for if they refuse, they might provoke the animosity of their Christian neighbors. Lurid stories of supposed Jewish plots to kill Christians often begin with innocent, unsuspecting Christian children playing with Jewish children, who lure them into their homes where they meet their fate. These stories aim, among other things, to dissuade parents from letting their children play with Jewish children. So these are stories in this whole issue I've explored in my recent book. You see the cover here, England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century. And we can move to the next slide. So I don't have time in my brief talk tonight to try to sweep through all the material I cover in my book, but I'd like to look at three themes that highlight both how deeply integrated Jews were in 13th century English society, and paradoxically how precarious their position was. First, I want to look at economic exploitation, the crown, the barons, and the Jews. Then at dangerous fraternization from the point of view of some Christian clerics, at least. English bishops attempt to limit contact between Jews and Christians. And finally, from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, forging hostile legends. So next slide, please. So we're going to look first at, here we have a few key dates in the history of Jews in medieval England. We know that Norman Jews from Rouen in Normandy arrived shortly after 1066, which of course is the date when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, conquered England and became King of England. So he allowed Jews to arrive. The first Jews were probably all in London, and little by little, they were allowed to settle in other towns where they were always very dependent on the king's protection and favor. About 75 years after they first arrived, under the reign of King Stephen, Jews were allowed to settle outside London, the main towns of the kingdom. They became important agents, both in collaboration, at times in rivalry with monasteries, providing financing for business endeavors and building projects. Whereas prior to Stephen's reign, money lending had been in the hands of monasteries and of Anglo-Saxon merchants and bankers in the principal towns. In the second half of the 12th century, Stephen and his successors, Henry II and Richard I, took measures favoring the Jews as their preferred moneylenders and facilitated their settlement in towns across England. They played a key role in financing trade between England and the continent and generated income that the king could tax. The activity of Jewish financiers grew over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries as English economy expanded. Demographically, the Jews were insignificant. In 1240, there were perhaps at most 5,000 Jews in England, out of a total population about 5 million, which meant that they represented roughly 0.1% of the population of the kingdom. And this Jewish population was concentrated in the principal towns. In Norwich, for example, around 1200, port town that was the largest town, one of the largest towns in England at the time, there were perhaps 200 Jews, 2% of a total population, about 10,000. Yet English Jews had assets of about 200,000 marks, roughly 1/3 of the total value of circulating coinage. In an average year, the king would tax these Jewish moneylenders about £3,000, roughly 15% of the crown's total revenue. To this amount could be added considerable sums such as fines for offenses, real or imaginary, committed against the king or against other Christians, or relief, which was a sort of succession tax. On the death of a Jew, his heirs had to pay 1/3 of his wealth in order to inherit the remaining 2/3. No wonder that historian Cecil Roth declared that England's Jews were the royal milk cow. Heavy as these financial burdens were to English Jews, they didn't prevent a number of moneylenders from accumulating considerable wealth. Yet in the 1240s, the situation began to change. Deeply in debt, mired in failed military adventures, King Henry III sought to raise money wherever he could, in particular from his Jews who, unlike his other lay and clerical subjects, did not need to consent to new taxes. Between 1240 and 1258, about half of English Jews' wealth had been transferred into the royal coffer via tallages, which are exceptional taxes that the king levied on Jews. In this period, revenue from English Jews allowed the king to increase overall royal revenue by about 1/3. Henry's excessive taxation was, however, starving the royal milk cow, and Jews became increasingly unable to provide financial services or to pay new taxes to the crown. At the end of Henry's reign and during the reign of his son and successor, Edward I, the crown had to turn to foreign moneylenders, mostly Italian bankers. England's Jews were dispensable, it seems, for Edward expelled them from the kingdom in 1290. And this brings us, we can go to the next slide, to a conflict in which Jews became particularly victims. The Second Barons' War, which led to massacres of Jews and temporary annulment of much of the loans that Jews had made. So here are just a few events from this Second Barons' War. What happened was Henry III was a very unpopular king. He had failed military adventures in France and in Italy. To pay for these failed military adventures, he taxed his subjects heavily, his Christian subjects, including the church, but also his Jewish subjects. And this eventually provoked a revolt. He was also accused of favoring too much some of his French relatives, his wife's relatives. So there was in 1258 a meeting at Oxford in which barons proposed something called the Provisions of Oxford and forced Henry to sign it, which was basically limiting royal power and establishing a council of barons to rule with or alongside the king, and particularly to limit taxation. However, and we see in the key dates here, in April 1261, Henry managed to get the Provisions of Oxford annulled by the Pope Alexander IV. Simon of Montfort, Earl of Leicester, was one of the barons who became head of the rebels. And he, by the way, had already expelled the Jews from his city of Leicester almost 30 years before. So he then, in 1264, the issue was taken to Louis IX, Saint Louis, King of France, who was Henry's overlord for many of his territories. And Louis sided with the king against the barons, also proclaiming the annulation of the Provisions of Oxford. So this provoked open warfare. Simon of Montfort led rebels in rebellion against the king. Starting in 1264 in the Welsh marshes, and the city of Worcester, where Jews were attacked and killed. In April 1264, there was a massacre of London Jews, and as often these barons and rebels who attacked Jewish communities not only killed Jewish moneylenders, but also destroyed the loan records, because many of them were in debt to Jewish moneylenders. Finally, in May 1264, Simon of Montfort defeats King Henry III in the Battle of Lewes. He captured the king and his son, Prince Edward, the future Edward I, and he subsequently annuls much of the debt to Jewish lenders. So between 1264 and 1265, Henry is captive, and he continues to issue proclamations, but under the control of Simon. So Simon is basically ruling England under the king's name. Finally, in 28 May 1265, Prince Edward makes a dramatic escape and rallies the royal armies, which finally defeat and kill Simon in the Battle of Evesham. So these events, which I've resumed quickly, have important consequences for English Jews, because many Jews were massacred in London and in other cities. Others took refuge in the Tower of London and other places where some royal officials, still loyal to King Henry and to Edward, protected them. And after this, Edward and Henry and then Edward allowed the Jews to resume their money lending activities. But shortly thereafter, in 1275, King Edward I required the Jews to stop lending money at interest, and finally, in 1290, had them expelled. So it's possible to construct a narrative based almost exclusively on financial and economic forces to explain the importance of the Jews to the English economy and society, and also of their subsequent demise and expulsion. The barons attacked Jews because they were in debt to Jews, and finally, Edward expelled the Jews when they no longer seemed necessary. So this is an important part of the story, but it's not all of the story by any means. And we can move to the next slide and move to the second part of my talk. Part of the pressure to expel the Jews from England in 1290 came from English bishops and the circle of advisors to King Edward I. They expressed worries about the dangers of close contact between Jews and Christians. Day-to-day fraternization with those who refused to recognize Christ would create doubt in Christians' minds, they feared, and even lead to apostasy. These concerns were not new in 1290. They'd been expressed in England and elsewhere in Christendom long before, and we can go to the next slide. Now, this is a decree from the Fourth Lateran Council, which was one of the principal councils of the medieval church, held at the Lateran Palace in Rome, presided by by Pope Innocent III. And these church councils proclaimed legislation in the form of what they call canons, and the Fourth Lateran Council proclaimed 70 canons, several of which have to do with Jews, including this one, Canon 68, which says that in some provinces, Jews and Saracens, meaning Muslims, dress differently from Christians. But in other places in Europe, this isn't the case. So this council obliges Jews and Muslims living in Christian lands to wear distinctive clothing so that they can be distinguished from Christians. So you'll know if you are talking with a Jew or a Muslim. Why? In order to avoid illegal sexual contact, because there was marriage between Christians and non-Christians was unauthorized, and even any sexual contact was, in theory, prohibited. So this is a decision made by the Church Council, Lateran IV. But of course, the church has no real authority to make Christian kings enforce this legislation. And of course, the church has no direct authority over the Jews because the church has authority only over Christians. So it is not, but this supposed requirement was not respected everywhere in Europe by any means. But we can move to the next slide and see that the first king to impose such clothing restriction on Jews was Henry III. And here we see a mandate that he sent to the sheriff, his royal officer in Worcester, and as we see at the bottom, to sheriffs in other towns. And these are some of the principal towns in which we know Jews lived at this time. This is 1218. And the king says that all Jews, whether they walk or ride in or outside the city, should wear on their chest, anywhere on their outer garments, 2 white tablets made of linen cloth or parchment, so in this way Jews may be distinguished from Christians with a clear sign. Now, these 2 white tablets are in the form of the tablets of the law that Moses received on Sinai, and so they're meant to be a distinguishing mark. And clearly, this king didn't have this idea all by himself, particularly since we know that at the time he was an 11-year-old boy who had succeeded to the throne at a young age at the death of his father, King John. And the real rulers were a group of 3 men who were the royal, the regents, the Regency Council, who ruled in the king's name. And one of them was a papal legate, in other words, a representative of the Pope, Guala Bicchieri. And so we can pretty reasonably guess that this is Guala Bicchieri, who had been at the Lateran Council in Rome 3 years earlier, who pushed the Royal Council to have this mandate issued in Henry's name. So theoretically, one might think that starting in 1218, all Jews in England had to wear these badges. But in fact, we know from other documents this wasn't quite the case. And we can move to the next slide. And here we see a summary of records from the receipt rolls of the year of Easter 1221. Now, the receipt rolls are royal documents in which royal officials record all the monies received to the crown, and they record each time who paid the money, how much they paid, and for what reason. It can be a fine, it can be for some sort of privilege, it can be a tax, etc. And we have in the Easter receipt rolls, they were given twice a year, once at Easter and once in the fall. And in these Easter receipt rolls in 1221, we have 35 entries in which Jews pay money to royal officials pro tabula non potanda, in order not to be obliged to wear this badge, or tablets as they call them. So we can see that what Henry is doing, or what the royal counselors acting in his name are doing, is they've theoretically obliged the Jews to wear these badges, but they can sell exceptions. So here, a number of Jews are paying good money in order not to have to wear these badges. So this shows that the paradox. Royal power is expressed in being able to impose this regulation on Jews, but also being able to sell exceptions. And as you can imagine, some of the churchmen were not very happy about this, because the Fourth Lateran Council meant to really have Jews wear these badges to make them distinguishable from Christians and avoid illegal sexual contact. So what happens, we can see the next slide, is the following year in 1222 at the Provincial Council of Oxford. And here, the Provincial Council of Oxford was presided by Stephen Langton, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, in other words, the prelate of the English Church, who brought together this council. And Stephen Langton had also been at Lateran Fourth Council in 1215, and he called this council in 1222 in order to adopt and impose many of the decisions from Lateran IV on the English Church, and adapting it sometimes to the needs of the English Church, including several items concerning Jews. And I won't read this to you, but briefly here, it's on Jews and their slaves. In fact, Jews didn't have slaves at this time, but they had Christian servants in their houses. And this is something that churchmen continually, repeatedly try to prohibit, often to little avail. So here they say that the Jews should not work, that the Christians should not work for Jews. Jews should not employ Christians. If we look at the next slide, there's a second canon dealing with Jews, which is quite specifically on this question of wearing these tablets. So here we see, if you look towards the middle of this text, the council declares that each and every Jew, whether male or female, shall wear clearly exposed on the outer garments, on the chest, woolen tablets of a different color from that of the garment, so that each patch shall measure, and we have the measurements and so forth. And so clearly, the year before, we saw Jews are paying good money in order not to wear these tablets, and the church is trying to say, yes, they have to wear them. So the church is trying to go against what the king has allowed these Jews to do. And of course, the question is how this church council is going to enforce it, since they have no jurisdiction, direct jurisdiction over Jews. And it says they shall be compelled by ecclesiastical censure. What does that mean? Well, if we look at the next slide, we can see very clearly what that means. So here we have later the same year, this is November 1222, a declaration of Henry III, a mandate that he sends to the sheriff of Lincoln and the mayor of Canterbury. He says, our Jews of Lincoln have shown to us that by an edict of our venerable fathers, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Lincoln, it is decreed about the Jews that no one shall sell them any food, nor have any communication with them, nor receive anyone who sells them anything. So we see what this ecclesiastical censure in the last text meant. It meant that Jews, certainly the church had no authority over Jews, but the church could prohibit Christians from selling Jews food, which would obviously mean that Jews would have to comply with these regulations. Except instead of complying, these Jews of Lincoln complained to the king. And to continue the text, the king proclaims, therefore we command you that after seeing our letters, you shall in our behalf cause it to be ordered and proclaimed throughout your district that food shall be sold to them. And if you find anyone who shall refuse to sell them food or other necessities in the district of Canterbury or anywhere else, you shall capture him and keep him in safe custody until further order. In other words, if you refuse to sell food to Jews, you're going to be put in jail and the king will decide what to do with you. So here we see a direct conflict between this ecclesiastical legislation and the royal legislation. And in this case, the Jews were able to get the king on their side and to prohibit this. So let's look at the next slide. So these issues continued to plague churchmen and continued to be thorns in the side of various bishops for the following decades. And here is a writ that is now in the National Archives near London, which I examined and edited, by Richard of Gravesend, who's bishop of the city of Lincoln. And he excommunicated 14 Christians working in Jewish homes. And these are most 13 women and one man who are working as domestic servants in Jewish homes. And this is a practice which had been prohibited not only in England but elsewhere in Europe, particularly in church legislation. And here, what's new, or at least the first time I've seen this, is that the bishop is actually naming the Jews that he's excommunicating, naming the Christians that he's excommunicating, because obviously he can't excommunicate Jews, they're not part of the church, but he's excommunicating these Christians who are working for Jews. And there is little evidence, however, that this excommunication had any effect, because there's no evidence that these people were actually ever punished. We can move to the next slide, which has another example of the supposed dangers of fraternization. And here, I won't read you the text, but Richard of Swinfield, who's Bishop of Hereford in the west of England, wrote 2 letters to his chancellor in August 1286. And the first letter, Richard was out of town. He's writing to his chancellor. He's saying, I've heard that a prominent Jew in our city of Hereford is having a wedding, throwing a wedding for his grandson, and that this Jew has had the temerity to invite his Christian neighbors. And you should tell the Christians that they cannot go to this Jewish wedding because they shouldn't fraternize with Jews, they shouldn't honor them, they shouldn't toast to their health and well-being, etc. So he says, not only are you going to announce this in church, but you have to proclaim it in the streets so that even those people who don't go to church will know about this prohibition. And then about a week later is a second letter from the same bishop, in which he's furious because a lot of these Christians have gone to this wedding and they danced and they drank and they toasted to the long life of the Jewish couple. And everyone seemed to have a great time, which made the bishop furious. And he said, all of these Christians must be listed. You've got to come up with a list, and you've got to excommunicate them all. And they need to come to me to get penance so they can have the excommunication lifted. Here again, we don't know if there was any consequence to this, if any of people who were supposedly excommunicated ever did penance, or if they ignored it. And this could be a question of a cantankerous bishop who is trying to prevent this kind of fun, these kind of things that are going on all the time. Or it could be, as he suggests in his letters, that this kind of Jewish wedding with Christians openly invited was something rather rare. But there is a darker side to this, is that we know that Richard of Swinfield was one of the bishops in the circle of Edward I who pushed Edward to expel the Jews only 4 years later. Let's go for the time that's left to the next slide and to the third part, in which we see a third element that explains the demise of English Jewry and the expulsion of the Jews. For these churchmen, as we've just seen, as for other Christians, Judaism posed a theological and intellectual problem. Now, Oxford was home to a thriving Jewish community whose members were closely involved in the birth and development of the university, as they provided loans to students and teachers, rented out housing to them, and helped finance the acquisition of lands by scholarly patrons such as Walter of Merton, close advisor to King Henry and founder of Merton College. So we know that in Oxford, as in other cities, Jews played an important part in the local economy, and in Oxford in particular, in helping build the university. At the same time, Oxford Dons wrote theological works concerning the relations between Judaism and Christianity. So in chapter 4 of my book, I look at the history of English Hebraism, and particularly in Oxford, in other words, the study of Hebrew by English Christians. In particular, I look at the career of Robert Grosseteste, Chancellor of Oxford, and subsequently Bishop of Lincoln. As a theologian, university administrator, and bishop, Grosseteste reflected on the role of Jews in Christian society. He was a polymath, a scientist, philosopher, and theologian. He learned Hebrew late in his life and translated and wrote several works on Jews and Judaism. And these works, he concluded, as we will see, that Jewish sages had somehow known that Christ was their Messiah, but kept the knowledge hidden out of spite. We can go to the next slide. The idea that Jews were hostile to Christ and his mother and to their devotees was well established in 12th century Oxford as elsewhere in England and Europe. Jews often served as a foil to the miracle stories of the Virgin Mary. The Jew in these stories expressed doubts about her powers or hostility towards her cult. She chastised hostile Jews through miracles, which led to their punishment or to their conversion to the true faith. These stories remained popular in the 13th century. As we see in the Book of Hours here that William de Brailles composed around 1240 in Oxford for a patroness named Susanna. William lived on Catchy Street in Oxford, a stone's throw from Oxford's Jewish neighborhood. Various apocryphal stories extant in the 12th and 13th century relate that when the Virgin Mary died, the apostles carried her through the streets of Jerusalem, and a Jew named Jephonius, or in some versions, two Jews, tried to overturn her bier. His hands miraculously wither, or in some versions, an angel comes along and chops his hands off with a sword. The apostles then urge the Jew to humbly ask for forgiveness from the Virgin, which he does and is swiftly cured, leading to his conversion and that of the other Jews who witnessed the miracle. So William of Brailles here inserts the legend into a text for Compline, or night prayer, accompanying the text of Psalm 42, and illustrates it by showing two Jews with distorted, grimacing faces touching the bier borne by two haloed apostles. And we can go to the next slide where we see this continues. So what happens to these Jews is they are struck blind. Les Juifs aveugles, says the caption. The Jews are struck blind. And here we can see, and we can go to the next slide, we'll see the further developments in this. We see in each slide, we see on the left the page of this Book of Hours, and on the right the detail showing the illustration. And then this text is from Psalm 130, which concludes with the verse, "Let Israel hope in the Lord from henceforth, now and forever." In the initial to the psalm, one of the blinded Jews kneels in prayer before St. Peter. The caption explains that he asked Peter for mercy, and Peter asked him if he believed in Jesus. When the Jew replied yes, Peter wiped his eyes with the shroud that had covered Mary's body, and the Jew recovered his sight. Next slide. Indeed, those Jews who refused to believe, who had mocked the Virgin, attacked her funeral procession, could be cured through belief. Next slide. Yet not all Jews chose to believe. A final initial shows one blind Jew turning away from the shroud that could have restored his sight. The caption explains, "Qui ne veut croire un main aveugle." He does not wish to believe, stays blind. Those Jews who refused the miraculous grace of the Virgin during her life or after her death, including those Jews that William saw in the streets of Oxford, had chosen to remain blind. This is the message. Let me move to the next slide and quickly look at Robert of Grosseteste, Robert Grosseteste, as I mentioned, was a towering intellectual of 13th century Europe and England in particular. He was Franciscan lector at Oxford, Bishop of Lincoln, and in 1231, he wrote a letter to Margaret of Winchester, who had welcomed Jews that Simon of Montfort had expelled from Leicester. And he said, well, you can welcome these Jews, but you should make them do real work and farm the land and not let them lend money at usury. So this opinion of Grosseteste at the time that Jews shouldn't be lending money at usury didn't prevent him when he was Chancellor at Oxford and then Bishop of Lincoln from allowing Jews to continue to lend money. He recognized it was an important part of the economy, although he tried to limit the interest rates they could charge. He also tried to establish a Mount of Piety, a Christian lending institution to help give loans to students at Oxford. Now, Grosseteste was interested in Judaism, and he late in his life studied Judaism more in detail. He studied Hebrew, and he wrote something called the Cessatione Legalium, in which he said that it was not, he explained why Christians should not follow the Jewish law proclaimed in the Torah, because that law had been superseded by Christ's grace, so that anyone, Christian or Jew, who continues to follow this law does so in error. He also then translated two works, the Suda and the Testament of 12 Patriarchs, from Greek. And these were two texts. I won't go into great detail because I know that time is running short. But these were two texts which claimed to be authentic ancient texts, and which claimed that Jews during the life of Jesus had known that Jesus was the Messiah, but the Jewish leaders had known that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, but they had hidden this from other Jews out of spite for Jesus, out of spite for Christians, and that the Jewish elites even today still know this, but they still refuse to accept baptism out of spite. So here we have one of the strongest, most brilliant minds in English and European 13th century Christendom, accepting what are basically conspiracy theories, ridiculous stories from these texts, which claim that Jews somehow are innately hostile to Christians, and they know all along that they're right, but out of spite, they refuse. And the next and final side, so I don't have time here to catalog all the turbulence and violence suffered by English Jews over the course of the 13th century until their expulsion in 1290. What I've tried to do is trace the conversion causes for all of this. Lesser gentry get into debt to Jewish lenders, in some cases subsequently lose their land. An unpopular king and his entourage exploit the Jewish monopoly on lending at interest to impose harsh taxes on Jews and to seize their debtors' assets. A clergy wary of Jews, the only group that escaped the clergy's jurisdiction, sought to limit Jews' contacts with Christians. And then the promotion of lurid fake news by some writers associated with the church that accused Jews of stubborn refusal to recognize the truth of Christianity and a violent hatred to Christians. Edward expelled the Jews from England, but we should not let these 13th century English Jews who fully participated in the society and economy of the kingdom be forgotten, either for what they achieved or for what they suffered. We live in an age which, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, new forms of nationalist demagoguery based on racist propaganda rear their ugly heads. These ideologies rely on simplified, sanitized versions of national histories, in which minority groups, such as England's Jews, are deliberately ignored, and brutal crimes of the state and other actors, such as the violence against English Jews and their expulsion, are consigned to the dustbin of history. For these reasons, it seemed all the more urgent to me to recount the stories told in these pages, so that the Jewish men and women who lived in medieval England could make their voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for covering so much history in such a short amount of time and for really taking us through that. So we do have a lot of questions that are coming in, so we are going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. So I want to start with one that came in pretty early. If monasteries, I believe you mentioned, were also money lenders, how did they react to Jews being allowed to compete?
Well, we don't have any clear evidence of this. We know that there were some Jewish moneylenders in 12th century, Aaron of Lincoln, who claimed that he had done more to help finance the building of a certain monastery than anyone else, so that he should be, particularly honored. So there was a sense of Jews affirming their role in helping finance monasteries. But I don't know of any specific sense of monasteries feeling uh, uh, resenting the Jewish money lending activity.
Thank you. So yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in, but you mentioned that Jews would pay to not wear the tablets, I believe is what you said.
Mhm.
Why would Jews pay to not wear those? Like, was there a stigma associated with it? And did they have to pay yearly in order to not wear those?
Again, the evidence doesn't allow us to know exactly, to respond precisely to those questions. We know that these payments were especially in 1221, 1222. There are a few of them, and later years there are a few, but this gives the impression that they were only paid once, and that you didn't have them as regular payments. Why would Jews want to do this? Perhaps they felt that they were being stigmatized. They wanted to avoid the stigma, that it was some sort of humiliation. We know there are, I mean, other sources, rabbinic sources from Europe, in which rabbis are asked whether Jews can disguise and dress as Christians, even as Christians, Christian priests and nuns, to avoid being harassed or attacked when they travel. And
Mhm.
this was granted in some cases. So it may be that some Jews felt that standing out as a Jew visually was not either desirable or safe.
And that actually is a great segue to another question that came in.
Mhm.
Um, we see in other countries where Jews were expelled from that they had the option of converting to Christianity in order to stay.
Mhm.
Was that an option for them here? And did did any of them take it? If so,
Yes, it was an option, and we know that Henry III had established what he called the Domus Conversorum, the House of Converts,
Mhm.
which was a sort of semi-monastic establishment in which Jews who converted to Christianity could live and their needs would be taken care of. So
Mhm.
there was some encouragement. I say some, not too much encouragement, because Jews who converted lost all of their income. They had to give all of their income to all of their wealth to the crown. So this was sometimes the sort of the best option for Jews who had already lost money, and in some cases lost family members to violence, and who would convert and join this Domus Conversorum. There were we also know that towards the end of his reign, Henry tried to place certain Jewish converts in monasteries and wrote to monasteries saying, you need to take these Jews that I'm sending and put them up in your monastery. The
uh,
Jews meaning actually converts, Jewish
right.
converts to Christianity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And we have a lot of questions coming in that I'm gonna combine them a little bit. Is did Jews participate in any other fields besides money lending, and is there evidence for it in the historical record?
Now, yeah, most of the evidence we have is about money lending, because that was the royally controlled monopoly for much of the 13th century. The Jews were the only ones authorized to lend money at interest, and that the whole administration of money lending was controlled by the crown, and so there's a lot of documentation. There's not a lot of documentation for other activities, although we know some Jews owned land. We know some Jews were landlords. For example, at Oxford, both students and faculty sometimes stayed in houses that were owned by Jews and rented out. So, and of course, there's farming, there's other things going on, but most of their activity is in urban areas, in cities where they're allowed to live. And we know the other evidence we have is from texts that liturgical texts and poems and so forth. So we know there was religious and intellectual activity, of course.
Thank you. And another question that came in is, was there any sort of internal Jewish leadership in England during this time, maybe based around rabbis or a more secular based leadership?
Yeah, there was a group of rabbis that was sort of a council around the king. There was there were Christian royal officials who were appointed to oversee the Jewish exchequer, the administration that regulated Jewish lending. But we know there were some. For example, we have occasions in which one prominent Jew of Oxford, David of Oxford, wanted to divorce from his wife, who hadn't given him an heir. So he asked English rabbis for permission to do so. They appealed to rabbis in France. And at this point, David went to the king, and the king allowed him to divorce. And the king said that these English Jews shouldn't be appealing to foreign authorities, meaning Jews in France at the time when England was at war with France. So there was, we see through these conflicts, we see these authorities that were clearly shifting, and rival bases of power.
Thank you. And do you know where where Jews who had been expelled from England, where they settled primarily, or
yes, primarily in France. And he went to France, where they were expelled from France in 1306, so just 16 years later. And then we have, some evidence of those Jews who went down to Provence, in which now the south of France, but was outside of the Kingdom of France at the time. So yeah, afterwards they were dispersed, elsewhere in Europe.
And this question might be a little bit hard to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You mentioned how a lot of, these beliefs were coming from priests and other members of the clergy, but were these sort of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish beliefs held by lay people, or was it really coming mostly from clergy?
It's hard to say. Most of the texts we have that talk about these the legends of Jewish ritual murder of Christian children, for example, or Jewish host desecration, in which Jews are accused of torturing the Eucharistic wafer. Most of these come from ecclesiastical sources. So, and that's been one subject of debate among historians. Are we looking at a popular prejudice that comes from below, or is this, on the contrary, a prejudice that comes from above, imposed by the church? And we don't know enough to really be able to say, but I would tend rather to the second theory. And to come back to one of the texts I mentioned, these letters of the Bishop of Hereford, 1286, we see Christians and Jews partying together, in Hereford, enjoying drinking and dancing and having a great time together. And some people, some historians said, well, the Jews were expelled because Christians, hated Jews, and there was this sort of increasing pressure and increasing hatred until finally they were expelled. Well, here's just 4 years before, and of course there can be violence, but also there's, clearly these are not people that hate each other who are partying together.
Right. Thank you. And I know we are getting close to time, but I do want to end with one final question. When were the Jews allowed back into England? And if you know the circumstances around that, could you maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it was in the 17th century under Oliver Cromwell,
Mhm.
after the English Civil War, in which Charles the First, King Charles the First, was beheaded in 1649, and it was after that, during Cromwell's rule, that Jews could return to England. So that means that, yeah, there were 2.5 centuries or more in which there were no Jews in England, which did not, unfortunately, prevent anti-Semitism, because you see the imaginary Jews in works of Shakespeare and Milton and others, who are still used as a foil in these anti-Semitic tropes.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us and for answering all of those questions in a very short amount of time. I learned so much, and I think everybody else out there did as well. So thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
Well, thank you, Sydney, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to encourage everyone to buy John's book, England's Jews, which you can do at the link in the chat. I really highly encourage you to check it out. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. You can watch past program and view and share today's recording, which is going to be available later this week on the museum's YouTube channel. So thank you again, John. Have a great night, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.